The late autumn night had a bitter chill, the kind that seeps through the cracks of old windows and settles deep in your bones. I was living alone in a modest house on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, having just moved away from the city for some quiet and space. The house was older, built sometime in the 1940s, with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and a backyard that backed up to thick woods. I liked the isolation at first, the way the darkness stretched out beyond my porch, unbroken except for the distant flicker of a street lamp miles away. I worked from home, mostly during the day, but my sleep schedule was erratic, so I often stayed up late watching movies or reading. The night in question began like most others. Around 2 a.m., I was curled up on the couch, a blanket over my legs and a book in my hands. Outside, a cold wind whispered through the trees, rattling the leaves and brushing softly against the siding of my house. Then I heard it. At first, just a faint, almost imperceptible sound, something like the slow crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze, heart quickening. I lived alone. No one was supposed to be outside. My house was at the end of a dead-end street, the last house before the woods. No cars passed this late. No one should be here. I set the book down and listened harder. The footsteps came again. Deliberate, slow, measured, like someone was trying not to make noise, but couldn't quite manage it. They paced just beyond the backyard, near the thick line of trees that marked the property line. I peered through the curtains, but the porch light flickered and cast long shadows that merged with the darkness beyond. I couldn't see anything clearly. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a stray animal. The sound of rustling leaves and twigs snapping was consistent with that. And in rural areas, wildlife wasn't unusual. Still, the footsteps were too regular, too heavy. Not an animal. My pulse quickened. I locked the front and back doors, checked the windows. Then I turned on every light I could find in the house. As I did, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I strained my ears, expecting the sound to start again, expecting to see movement in the shadows beyond the porch. But there was nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination or an animal. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But then the knocking started. Soft, deliberate knocks at the back door. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. I stood frozen. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. Someone was outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my location into the receiver. The dispatcher told me help was on the way and to stay inside and keep locked. I sat in the darkest corner of the living room, eyes glued to the back door's window. The knocks continued for nearly 5 minutes, then nothing. When the police arrived, they swept the yard and the perimeter, but found no one. No footprints, no evidence anyone had been there. The next day, I found the porch light had been smashed. I never heard footsteps again, but every night I felt like someone was watching me from the woods just beyond my yard. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I moved out a month later. Sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I think about those knocks, and I wonder who was outside. Story the end. The night everything started felt like any other. I was working the graveyard shift at a small convenience store on the outskirts of a quiet town in Oregon. The store was the kind that stayed open 24/7 because it was near the highway, and truckers or late-night travelers would stop by for snacks, gas, or a quick coffee. I was alone, as usual, with the exception of the occasional customer. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m., when I first noticed it. Someone outside the store, standing just beyond the dim glow of the parking lot lights. I'd been working there for over a year, and nothing about this place had ever made me nervous. The parking lot was usually empty at this hour, and the surrounding area was bordered by thick woods. That night, the figure stood still, just past the edge of the light, barely visible but unmistakably human. I looked up from the cash register and squinted through the glass door. The person wasn't making any movements, no pacing, no gesturing, just standing. There was something off about the way he held himself, too rigid, almost unnatural. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but shrugged it off. Maybe someone was just waiting for a ride or trying to stay warm. I went back to the counter and kept an eye on the figure through the window. Minutes passed and the figure didn't move, didn't even blink. It was as if he was staring straight at me, waiting. Suddenly, the power flickered. The overhead lights in the store dimmed for a second before stabilizing. When the lights steadied, the figure was gone. I took a deep breath and told myself to stop imagining things. Night shifts could make anyone paranoid. The next few nights, the same thing happened. At roughly the same time, I would notice the figure lurking just outside the illuminated area, motionless and watching. Sometimes the flicker of the streetlights would hide him, and sometimes he seemed to retreat, just as I looked. One night, I decided to confront him. I walked out the door with my phone flashlight on, stepping into the cold night air. The parking lot was eerily silent except for the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I scanned the darkened edges beyond the lights, but saw nothing. "Hey," I called out. "You all right?" No answer. I circled the perimeter of the lot, heart pounding. Still nothing. I called the police, but they told me there was no one around when they drove by. I felt ridiculous, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few nights later, as I was about to close, I heard tapping on the glass door. The kind of tapping that's slow and deliberate. I looked up and saw a pale face pressed against the glass. The eyes were dark, hollow, and completely still. I jumped back, knocking over a display rack. When I looked back, the face was gone. I locked the doors immediately. The rest of the shift was a blur of anxiety. The next day, I spoke to the manager about installing cameras. He laughed it off, telling me it was probably just some prankster or homeless person passing through. But I wasn't so sure. Weeks went by with more sightings, more silent tapping on the windows and doors. Once, I found scratches on the back door, as if someone had tried to claw their way in. I stopped sleeping. My dreams were plagued with shadowy figures standing just beyond the light, staring, waiting. One night, I heard footsteps on the roof above me. Heavy, slow footsteps. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, but when I went outside, the roof was empty. The police were called again, but they never found anything. Then came the night when I was alone closing up, and I heard breathing right outside the front window. Slow, labored breaths. I turned off the lights and pulled the blinds closed, but the sound kept coming. The next morning, I found handprints smeared on the glass, wet and cold to the touch. I quit the job the next day. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear tapping on windows or footsteps when I'm alone. I never found out who or what it was, but every time I'm alone late at night, I remember the cold stare just outside the light. Story, the end. The night I first realized someone was outside my house wasn't a night I'll ever forget. It started out like any other evening. I had just finished a long day at work, late, tired, and ready to unwind. My small apartment was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. I liked the peace it gave me after the chaos of the city center, but I also appreciated the feeling of being tucked away, somewhat invisible. That night, the air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your skin sticky and restless. I just settled on the couch with a beer and the remote when I heard it, a soft thud against the back window. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing the glass, but the noise repeated. Thud, thud, a slow, deliberate tapping. I paused the TV and listened carefully. The window overlooked the backyard, which was fenced in and shadowed by an old maple tree. I flicked on the porch light to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but the light barely reached past the fence line. I grabbed my phone and walked cautiously to the window, looking out through the blinds. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just some stray animal. The neighborhood had its fair share of raccoons and feral cats, but as I turned away, the tapping came again, this time louder, closer, and more rhythmic. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My heart started to beat faster. I wasn't sure if I was more scared or curious. I crept toward the back door, which had a glass panel. I cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, moonlight casting silver shadows over the grass. No sign of movement. The tapping stopped. I shut the door and locked it tightly, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was my imagination. I forced a laugh, telling myself how ridiculous I was being. I went back to the couch and turned on a crime documentary to distract myself. Then came the knocking, this time on the front door. It was slow and steady, 3 knocks spaced evenly apart. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know anyone who would be knocking on my door at this hour. I live alone, and friends knew better than to drop by unannounced, especially this late. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out. Empty street. Quiet. The street lamp flickered above, buzzing softly. I closed the door and locked it again. Heart pounding, I backed into the living room and called a friend just to have someone on the line. My voice was shaky, and I couldn't explain why exactly I felt so unnerved, but I needed a lifeline. I told them about the noises. They laughed nervously and said it was probably just a prank or some drunk kid messing around. That made me feel a little better. I tried to laugh it off and promised myself I'd check the locks again before going to bed. I double-checked every window and door. Everything was locked tight. Then I made a pot of tea and sat down with my phone on the couch, trying to relax. But that's when I noticed my phone's camera flash blinked on in the corner of the room, even though I hadn't touched it. Weird, I thought. Maybe a glitch. Suddenly, I heard a soft shuffle just outside the living room window. I stared at it for a few seconds, paralyzed. Then movement. A shadow flickered past the window, fleeting but unmistakable. I swallowed hard and stood up. I grabbed the nearest object, which was a metal flashlight, and slowly approached the window. The window was covered with blinds again, but this time I pulled one slat aside and looked out. There, just beyond the bushes, I saw it. A figure. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, standing completely still. My breath hitched. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I knew no one would answer. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. The flashlight in my hand felt useless. I shut the blinds quickly and backed away. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the wooden deck outside the back door. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I ran to the back door and locked it again, but the footsteps kept circling, passing from one side of the house to the other. Panic started to set in. My hands trembled as I called 911. The operator's calm voice was a small comfort as I described the situation. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The house was silent, except for the sound of my shaky breathing. Then the front door handle rattled violently. My heart leapt into my throat. I was trapped. I retreated to the bedroom, locked the door, and slid the dresser in front of it. I sat on the floor, phone in hand, waiting for the police. Minutes later, I heard sirens wailing in the distance. The figure outside started pacing again, this time back and forth on the porch. I flicked off the bedroom light and stayed as still as possible. The footsteps faded as the police car pulled up. Officers quickly surrounded the house, shining flashlights and calling out. The figure ran into the darkness. The officers searched the yard but found nothing. They stayed with me for a while, taking statements and reassuring me. They told me they'd patrol the area. Eventually, they left. I sat in the dark bedroom, lights off, listening to every sound. Then my phone vibrated. A message. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'm still outside." I dropped the phone. That was the last straw. I called the police again. They told me they'd be right back. While waiting, I stayed silent, lights off, terrified of making any noise. Eventually, the officers returned, checking the perimeter once more. They couldn't find anyone. In the following days, I installed security cameras around the house. They showed nothing unusual during the day, but at night, the footage revealed something chilling. At exactly the time of the incidents, a shadowy figure appeared on the back porch, pacing and sometimes just standing motionless, staring at the house. When the porch light came on, the figure vanished. No one was ever caught. I moved out shortly after. The police never found the intruder, and I never learned who or what it was. But sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear tapping on my window. Story, the end. It was a cold, windy night in late October when it started. I was living alone in a small rented house on the outskirts of a quiet town. Not much around except a few other homes spaced far apart in a thick patch of woods behind my backyard. I had moved there a couple of months earlier for work, hoping for some peace and quiet, a place to focus and write without distractions. But that night, peace was the last thing on my mind. I was sitting in my living room, watching a late-night documentary on some obscure topic I barely cared about when I heard a faint sound outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching softly on the gravel driveway that led up to my front door. I froze, listening carefully. The street was empty, no cars or people for miles, and the only light outside was the weak yellow glow from my porch light, flickering slightly from the breeze. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or someone out for a late night walk, maybe lost. But something about the sound felt different. Too heavy, too cautious, as if the person didn't want to be noticed. I got up and walked slowly to the window, keeping out of sight behind the curtains. Peeking through a crack, I saw nothing but darkness and the dim outline of the trees. The footsteps stopped abruptly just beyond the edge of the porch. My heart started pounding. I turned off the TV, grabbed my phone, and checked the time, 3:14 a.m. I debated calling the police, but figured it might be nothing, or worse, a false alarm. Maybe some drunks or pranksters. Still, I locked all the doors and windows again, made sure the back gate was latched, and tried to calm myself down. For the next hour, I sat in the dark, listening. Every now and then, I caught the sound of footsteps or a faint scratching noise near the windows. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the porch light, but when I blinked, it was gone. I even turned on the porch light to see if that would scare whoever it was away, but the noises only grew louder. Then came the banging. It wasn't hard pounding, but slow and deliberate, like someone was testing if the door was locked. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare move. I stared at the door, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch hitting the wood. But the knocking continued for several minutes, soft, rhythmic, and chilling. I sent a quick text to my best friend Jake, just saying, "Someone's outside. I'm scared." No reply. The knocking stopped suddenly. Silence swallowed the house. I wanted to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I just sat there, clutching my phone, eyes glued to the door. Then the doorknob started to slowly turn. I scrambled back from the door and grabbed a baseball bat from the corner, the only weapon I had. The knob turned again, this time more firmly. Someone was trying to open it. I whispered, "Who's there?" but got no answer. My phone buzzed, Jake finally replying, "Call the cops." I dialed 911, whispering into the phone, explaining the situation. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep the doors locked. The knob twisted again and again. After what felt like an eternity, a loud banging sounded from the back door. I ran to the kitchen, peering out the small window beside the sink. Through the darkness, I saw a shadow moving just behind the fence that separated my yard from the woods. The figure was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and seemed to be circling the house slowly. My stomach churned. "Please hurry." I whispered to the dispatcher. Suddenly, all noises stopped. No footsteps, no knocking, nothing. The porch light flickered and went out, plunging everything into pitch black. I felt like I was suffocating in fear. A faint glow appeared through the window. It was the flash of a flashlight moving outside, scanning the yard. I was about to shout when I noticed the beam stop and focus right on the window I was looking through. My breath caught. Then a voice, low, calm, and terrifyingly close to the glass, whispered, "Let me in." I dropped the bat, frozen in place, unable to move or scream. The flashlight beam moved slowly down the wall of the house, circling back toward the front door. Just then, headlights flashed down the street. The cops had arrived. I rushed to the door and opened it to find 2 officers stepping out of their patrol car. I told them everything, shaking uncontrollably. They searched the yard but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no one hiding. "We'll keep an eye on the area," one officer said, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Probably just some kids messing around. I thanked them, but didn't feel safe. I stayed up all night, lights on, every noise making me jump. The next morning, I found strange things outside, small, muddy handprints on the porch railing, and several scratch marks on the doorframe. I wiped them off, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Days later, I checked with neighbors. Nobody had seen anyone suspicious, and nothing unusual was reported in the area. I tried to put it behind me, but late at night, I still hear footsteps outside. Sometimes just outside the window, I see that faint beam of light and the whisper of that voice. I moved out a few weeks after. They never found who it was or if it was human at all. But I'll never forget that night, the way someone or something stood outside my home, just waiting. Story the end. I remember the night clearly, even though it happened years ago. It's one of those memories that you never forget because it shakes you so deeply. This isn't a story anyone would want to dismiss as imagination because I know what I saw and what happened. It wasn't a dream or a trick of the mind. Someone was outside my house, and it was terrifying. I was living alone in a small, older house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families, and pretty safe by most accounts. I had just gotten off a late shift at work and was home alone like usual. My roommate had moved out a few months earlier, so I was used to the silence by then. I liked it most of the time, but that night it felt off. It was about 1:30 a.m. when I finally got inside after locking the door behind me. The house was dark except for the kitchen light I left on because I planned to make some coffee. I set down my bag, turned on the kettle, and pulled out a cup. As I waited, I noticed the faint sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a car passing by down the street, but then it became more distinct. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps pacing just outside my front door. I stopped and listened closely. The footsteps were soft but unmistakable on the gravel driveway leading up to my porch. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or someone walking their dog, but the neighborhood was quiet at this hour, and I hadn't heard any barking. My skin crawled. I moved toward the front window in the living room, careful not to make a noise. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. There was nothing in the street or on the porch itself. No car, no person. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, ready to call my friend if I needed to. But then I heard it again, a faint scratching noise on the side of the house near the back porch. My heart started pounding. I didn't have a dog or any pets, so it couldn't be an animal. I crept to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard and glanced out. The yard was pitch black, except for the dim moonlight. Nothing moved. Suddenly, a shadow flickered near the back gate. I froze. It was a man. Not a silhouette from far away, but a real person standing just outside the gate. He wasn't making a sound, just standing there like he was waiting for something or someone. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, whispering my address into the phone while keeping my eyes on the figure. The operator told me to stay calm and keep the doors locked. I backed away from the window and locked every door again, double-checking each one. The footsteps started again, but this time they moved around the side of the house, circling slowly, almost methodically. I wanted to scream, to run out and call for help, but something held me back. It was like my body was frozen by fear. Then the man was at the front porch steps, just beyond the door. I could see his face now, pale, gaunt, and his eyes were fixed on the front door, like he was staring straight at me. I held my breath. I whispered to the 911 operator, "He's right here. Please hurry." The man didn't try to knock or ring the bell. He just stood there, unmoving, like waiting for something. I don't know why, but I was terrified that if I made any noise, he would break the door down. Minutes felt like hours. Then suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing down the street. The man looked toward the street, then slowly backed away from my porch. He disappeared around the side of the house and into the shadows. The police arrived a few minutes later, and I explained what had happened. They searched the neighborhood but found no sign of the man. No footprints, no vehicles, nothing. I asked them if anyone had reported a suspicious person, but there was nothing on record. I never found out who he was or why he was outside my house that night. But that's not the end. Over the next few weeks, I kept hearing the footsteps outside at night. Always slow, always pacing near my door or around the house. I installed security cameras, but they never caught anything clear, just vague shadows moving out of frame. One night, the footsteps stopped, and instead I heard faint tapping on the windows. I was so terrified that I didn't sleep for days. Eventually, I moved out of that house. The new place is in a busier neighborhood, and I haven't heard footsteps outside since. I don't know what that man wanted or why he chose my house, but I know one thing. Someone was outside, watching me, waiting, and that feeling of being watched is something I'll never forget. Story the end. The night was unusually quiet for early November, the kind of silence that creeps into your bones and refuses to let go. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small place on the second floor of a building in a suburban neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had spent the entire day unpacking and finally decided to wind down by watching a movie late into the night. The clock on my phone read 1:47 a.m. when I heard it, a faint, slow tapping against the window. At first, I thought it might be a stray branch brushing against the glass, but the tapping was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I froze, listening closely. It came again, 3 soft taps, then a pause, then 2 more. The kind of sound you can't ignore. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my phone and checked my messages, anything to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. I lived on the second floor, so the window was just out of easy reach from the ground, but the sound was definitely coming from outside. I crept closer to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. The street was empty, bathed in pale moonlight and the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no shadow, no figure, just an eerie silence. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or some loose debris knocking against the building. I closed the curtain and went back to my movie, but the tapping returned, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing slowly outside. I stood up, every hair on my body standing on end. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, slow enough that I could count each step in my head. I checked the locks on my door and windows. All secure. Still, the sound continued, circling the building like a predator stalking its prey. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my sister asking if I was settled in. I typed back quickly, telling her I was fine, though my fingers trembled. Suddenly, a low scraping noise began beneath my window, like something or someone dragging a sharp object across the siding. I pressed my ear to the glass, trying to make sense of it. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft crunch of gravel on the driveway. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, my only weapon, and retreated to the living room. The tapping started again, this time on the front door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Just like before. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give away my hiding spot. I whispered, "Who's there?" But no answer. I dialed 911 with shaky fingers, whispering my situation to the dispatcher. The operator told me to stay calm and keep the doors locked. The knocking stopped. I waited, breath held, as the doorknob slowly began to turn. The door didn't open, but the knob rattled, like someone was trying to force it. I clutched the knife tighter, standing as far away from the door as possible. Suddenly, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the apartment. The only light was from my phone's screen. I texted my sister to call the police for me, since I couldn't hear the dispatcher anymore. No reply. Then, from outside the front door, I heard a faint whisper. "Let me in." The voice was calm, but there was something deeply wrong about it, like it was too familiar, yet wrong. It repeated, "Let me in," slower this time, almost pleading. I backed away, panic rising. I could hear footsteps retreating, then the sound of slow, heavy breathing right outside the door. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. It was a notification that the power was restored. The lights flickered back on. The door was still locked, but the silence outside was heavy. Minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming shut and tires peeling away on the gravel road. I called the police, who arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the area, but found no one. There were no footprints in the light dusting of frost, no signs of forced entry, and no evidence of anyone hiding nearby. I tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of whoever, or whatever, had been outside my door, whispering to be let in. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the door frame, faint but definitely there, as if someone had been clawing at it from outside. I moved out a week later. I never learned who or what was outside that night, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear those taps on my window calling out for me. Story, the end. It was late November, the kind of cold that creeps through the windows even when you think everything's sealed tight. I lived alone in a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves and nobody expected trouble. I worked nights at a local warehouse, loading trucks until the early morning hours, then came home to crash until the afternoon. On this particular night, I had just gotten back from work around 4 a.m. The streets were empty, frost coating the grass and sidewalks, the sky still thick and dark. I was tired, But something felt off the moment I pulled into my driveway. There was a strange silence, heavier than usual. I remember parking and stepping out of the car, noticing my breath fogging in the cold air. As I locked the car, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the bushes near the front porch. But I told myself it was nothing, probably just a cat or some stray animal. I walked to the door and unlocked it, fumbling with my keys, the cold making my fingers clumsy. When I finally pushed the door open and stepped inside, I switched on the lights and set my things down on the kitchen table. The warmth hit me immediately, and I sighed, relieved to be inside. I went straight to the bathroom to wash the grime of the night off my hands and face. The bathroom light flickered for a second, then stabilized. That flicker caught me off guard, but I shrugged it off. When I came out, I noticed the kitchen window was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it tight before leaving. The cold air was chilling the room more than it should have been. My stomach twisted. I locked the window and went back to the living room. That's when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside, on the front porch. The kind of slow, heavy footsteps that don't belong to any animal. My heart skipped. I froze. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but the silence returned. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely steady my own voice as I explained what I heard. They told me officers would be dispatched right away. I moved quietly to the front window and peeked through the blinds. Nothing. No one was there. The porch was empty except for the morning dew glistening on the wooden boards. I waited, holding my breath. Then the knocking started. 3 slow, heavy knocks, spaced apart, deliberate. I jumped back from the window, heart pounding, every hair on my body standing on end. Who would be knocking at this hour? I looked through the peephole. No one. The porch light was out, but the street lamp outside cast a dim glow. I locked the front door again and sat down on the couch, trying to calm down. The footsteps had stopped. The knocking ceased. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater. Minutes passed. I kept staring at the door, waiting for anything. Suddenly, a cold gust blew through the living room. The door I had just locked creaked slightly, as if pushed by something heavy. I leapt up and checked the lock. It was still secure. Then, a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, like someone breathing. I spun around, searching the room. Nothing. I pulled out my baseball bat from under the couch, gripping it tight. The police were still on their way, but who knew how long it would take? Then I heard a tapping, this time on the glass of the back door. I moved cautiously to the kitchen, heart in my throat. The backyard was fenced, dark, and empty when I looked out. The tapping continued, rhythmic and slow. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked. No answer. The tapping stopped. Then the sliding door handle rattled as if someone was trying to open it. I backed away, gripping the bat. At that moment, the police arrived. I flung the door open and yelled for them. 2 officers quickly entered, shining flashlights around the yard. They searched the perimeter, but found no one. They stayed with me for a while, checking windows and doors. The area was clear. After they left, I stayed up the rest of the morning, watching, listening. Days later, I installed cameras. Watching the footage, I saw a figure lurking just outside the fence late at night, motionless, watching the house. I never found out who it was. But every night after that, I could swear I heard footsteps knocking, tapping, and breathing just beyond my walls. Story, the end. The night had settled into an uneasy stillness by the time I realized something was wrong. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, almost oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Except there were no clouds, no wind, just a heavy silence pressing against the walls of my small suburban home. I lived alone, and that night, as with many others, I had been up late working on some freelance writing. The glow from my laptop was the only light in the living room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from outside my front door. At first, I thought it might be a branch caught in the wind or maybe some small animal scurrying by. But the noise persisted, slow and deliberate, like nails or a tool dragging against the wood of my porch. I froze, listening intently. My heart rate quickened when the noise stopped and was replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. I didn't want to look, but curiosity and fear tangled inside me. I quietly slipped to the window and peered through the blinds. The porch light was dim, struggling to push back the darkness, but through the faint glow I could just make out a figure standing near the edge of the porch. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, sat wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. His face was hidden in shadow. I swallowed hard, trying not to make a sound. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, and I whispered my situation, trying to keep calm as I described the man outside. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep safe inside. The man remained there, motionless for several minutes. Then, slowly, he started to move, circling the house, and his footsteps methodical, deliberate. Every time he passed a window, he paused just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of him. It felt like he was watching me. The porch light flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the front of the house, and I lost sight of him. The footsteps stopped abruptly, but then I heard a low, slow tapping on the front door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, exactly like the rhythm of the footsteps circling. My blood ran cold. I whispered into the phone, "He's knocking." The operator urged me to stay calm and keep the doors locked. I moved away from the door, backing into the kitchen where I kept a large chef's knife, the closest thing I had to a weapon. The knocking stopped. A long silence fell. Then came the slow turning of the doorknob. I pressed myself against the far wall, breath held, listening to the knob rattle and twist. Whoever it was tried to open the door, but it held firm. Then the doorknob stopped moving. Suddenly, I heard movement at the back of the house by the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. Soft, heavy footsteps approaching slowly. I grabbed my phone to text my neighbor, but the signal was weak and the message wouldn't send. The footsteps stopped just beyond the glass door. I strained to see, but the backyard was pitch black. Then the faint sound of scraping returned, this time on the patio railing, as if someone was dragging something sharp across the wood. My phone buzzed. Finally, a message from my neighbor asking if everything was okay. Before I could reply, the footsteps resumed, moving back around the side of the house toward the front. Then I heard it, a whisper right outside the front window, barely audible but unmistakably a voice saying, "Let me in." I screamed into the phone, trying to alert the dispatcher, but the voice repeated, louder this time, "Let me in." The porch light suddenly flickered back on, illuminating the figure standing just outside the window. His face was pale, eyes fixed on me with an unnatural intensity. I dropped the phone, stumbling back as the front door handle began to jiggle violently. Then, headlights blazed from the street. A car slowed down, then stopped. The man outside vanished instantly, retreating into the shadows. The police arrived moments later. They found no one, no footprints, no forced entry, only the scratch marks on my front door frame, deep, jagged, and fresh. I moved out a week later. Sometimes even now, late at night, I swear I hear tapping on the windows and the faint whisper outside my old house. Story the end. The evening had started out like any other. I was working late at the restaurant downtown, the kind of place where you finish your shift after midnight and the streets outside are nearly deserted. On that particular night, I was the last one left, closing up, wiping down tables, locking cabinets. The air was heavy with humidity, and a faint drizzle was starting to fall, making the sidewalks slick and shiny under the streetlights. It was about 1:30 a.m. when I finally slipped out the back door, keys jangling in my hand, ready to head home. My apartment wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk away. I had no car, and I liked the quiet of the city at night sometimes. It made me feel like I was in my own world, away from the noise and chaos of the day. The rain was light enough that I didn't bother with an umbrella, just pulled my hood up and started walking. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual glow of street lamps, the occasional sound of a car passing by, the distant barking of a dog. But as I got closer to my neighborhood, I noticed something strange. I felt eyes on me, like someone was watching from the shadows. I stopped at the corner near a closed convenience store and looked around. No one in sight, just the flicker of a broken streetlight buzzing above. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook it off and kept walking. The street leading to my building was narrow and lined with tall, old trees whose branches reached over the sidewalks like twisted arms. The rain had picked up a bit, dripping steadily from leaves. I quickened my pace, pulling my hood tighter. Then I heard it, a faint footstep behind me. I stopped abruptly and turned. Nothing, just the wet pavement glistening under the light. I started walking again, more quickly this time, heart pounding. A second step echoed behind me. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Still nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just another late-night walker or someone returning home. But the footsteps continued, matching my pace. I picked up speed to a jog. They quickened as well. I felt my breath coming out in shallow bursts, cold rain hitting my face, adrenaline flooding every nerve. I reached the entrance to my apartment complex, a modest two-story brick building with a locked gate. The lock was old and rusty, but I always had the key. I pulled it out of my pocket with trembling hands. As I fiddled with the lock, I caught a shadow moving quickly behind one of the parked cars just outside the gate. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to burst through my chest. I turned toward the shadow. A man emerged, tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie soaked from the rain. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but I could see his eyes, cold and unmoving. I dropped the key. He started to walk toward me, slow and deliberate. I scrambled to pick up the key, fumbling desperately. He was less than 10 feet away now. I managed to unlock the gate and shoved it open, sprinting through and slamming it shut behind me. The man stopped, leaning on the gate, staring at me silently. I ran up the stairs to my apartment door, heart hammering, hands shaking as I locked it behind me. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, trying to calm down. Then I heard it. Soft knocking on the door. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't dare move. I peeked through the peephole. No one. I stepped back. The knocking continued. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. Someone was trying to open the door. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then a faint scraping noise came from the window next to the door. I looked and saw muddy fingerprints smeared across the glass. I stayed on the phone, whispering, telling the operator what was happening. Suddenly, the figure appeared outside the window, just staring at me. His eyes met mine through the glass. A cold chill spread down my spine. I could barely breathe. Then, just as suddenly, he stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later. They searched the area but found no trace of the man. I spent the rest of the night awake, too afraid to close my eyes. After that night, I changed my routine. I never walked home late alone again. I moved out a few months later, but I never forgot the feeling of those eyes watching me from the rain, the sound of footsteps behind me, and the cold stare through the window. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear faint knocking. Story. The end. The autumn air had a sharp bite that night, a chill that seeped through the cracks of the old wooden house where I lived alone. I'd recently moved to a small town miles from the city, looking for quiet after a rough breakup and the stress of my old life. The house was old, creaky, and surrounded by dense woods, but I liked the isolation. I needed to focus on my writing and put the past behind me. I'd been working late that night, sitting in the living room with only my laptop and a dim lamp for light. The house was otherwise silent, save for the ticking of an old clock and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. At around midnight, as I was wrapping up an article, I heard it, a faint, irregular tapping noise coming from the back porch. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch knocking in the wind or a small animal. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention without making too much noise. I tried to ignore it, but unease settled deep in my chest. I stood and peered cautiously through the curtains. The porch light flickered, barely illuminating the dark outline of the yard. There was nothing there. No figure, no movement. I chalked it up to nerves and returned to my laptop. Moments later, the tapping returned, this time louder and closer. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. The sound was coming from right outside the sliding glass door that led to the porch. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and situation into the phone. The operator told me to stay on the line and keep the doors locked. I told her the tapping was still there, and suddenly I heard footsteps, slow, heavy steps pacing just beyond the glass. I felt completely frozen. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood. Then, clear as day, a voice whispered from outside, "Let me in." I choked on my breath, trying to hold still, afraid that any noise would draw the person closer. The voice repeated, "Let me in." Suddenly, the porch light went out and the footsteps started circling the house. I could hear the soft scraping of something being dragged along the siding. The footsteps returned to the front door, where a faint knocking began, slow and rhythmic. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. I told the operator about the knocking and whispered a plea for help. The door shook as the doorknob turned slowly. Someone was trying to get in. I clutched a kitchen knife, my only defense, as the doorknob rattled violently. I was terrified, but I stayed on the line, trying to stay calm. The power flickered and went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The knocking stopped. For a long, suffocating minute, there was only silence. Then, the voice whispered again, right outside my ear, "Please." Then the sound of retreating footsteps fading into the night. When the power came back on, the police had arrived. They searched the property but found no one. No footprints in the wet soil, no sign of forced entry, nothing except a few scratch marks on the doorframe. I never learned who it was or what they wanted, but that night left a permanent chill inside me. Even now, years later, whenever the wind taps against my window or a shadow passes just outside, I remember the voice that begged to be let in. Story, the end. It started with a noise, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. I was home alone one cold autumn night. The kind of night where the wind howled outside, rattling the windows just enough to make you a little uneasy. I was in my apartment on the second floor of a building in a quiet neighborhood, just winding down after a long day. The clock on the wall read 11:37 p.m. I was scrolling through my phone on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, when I heard it. A faint knock on the front door. Not the usual quick tap, but a slow, deliberate knock. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. I froze. Nobody was supposed to be visiting this late, especially not with the neighborhood being what it was. I live alone, and my closest friends knew better than to drop by unannounced at this hour. The building's lobby was locked, and the stairwell door was usually shut tight. I told myself it was probably someone delivering late-night mail or a package, but when I glanced through the peephole, nothing was there. No shadow, no figure. The porch light flickered intermittently, probably from the storm brewing outside, but still, nothing. Then the knocking started again, same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. I nearly jumped. I was suddenly very aware of how vulnerable I was, sitting alone in this tiny apartment with no one around for blocks. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend Tim. "Hey, you awake?" I whispered into the phone, trying not to sound too panicked. "Yeah. What's up?" he replied groggily. "There's someone outside my door knocking, like really knocking, and I can't see anyone through the peephole. Are you sure it's not an animal or something?" he asked. "No, it's too deliberate. It's like a pattern." There it was again. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. "Maybe call the landlord or the cops?" Tim suggested. "I'm thinking about it." I looked out the window facing the street. The streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalks. Not a soul was in sight. I debated opening the door just a crack to see who it was, but I knew better. The rational part of me wanted to scream at whoever it was to leave, but I was terrified. I didn't know what they wanted. Then the knocking stopped. Silence. I breathed a little easier. Maybe whoever it was got scared off. I tried to settle back into my couch when suddenly my phone buzzed with a text message. I thought it was Tim again, but it wasn't. It was from an unknown number. It read, "I'm right outside." My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I looked toward the front door, then the window again. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. I tried calling 911, but my phone glitched, frozen on the screen. The battery icon showed plenty of power, but the screen was unresponsive. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the drawer and held it tightly. The knocking started again, but this time it was louder, more frantic. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, then a long, steady pounding. I backed away from the door and moved to the back of the apartment, locking the sliding glass door. I peered outside, my breath fogging the glass. Nothing but the empty backyard and shadows. Then I heard it, a whispering voice, soft and raspy, just beyond the door. "Open up." I choked back a scream. I wanted to believe it was someone messing with me, maybe a drunk neighbor playing a prank. But the voice felt too close, too deliberate. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a pair of scissors, holding them in one hand, knife in the other. The knocking and pounding stopped abruptly. Silence. I was frozen, waiting for what felt like hours, but probably only minutes. Then the doorknob rattled violently. My heart slammed in my chest. I took a step back and turned the lights off, hoping the darkness would hide me. The door shook again. The voice came, louder this time. Open, please. I knew if I opened that door, I wouldn't get a second chance. I wasn't sure if I should call the cops again or try to find a way out through the back. But the back door was locked, and I had no car keys with me because I had walked home earlier. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the window. I whipped around to see glass shattered on the floor, the curtains swaying from the sudden draft. I could see a shadowy figure crouched outside the broken window, eyes glinting in the dim streetlight. I screamed and ran into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone again. Miraculously, it was working, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice came through. There's someone trying to break into my apartment, I whispered, voice shaking. Are you safe right now? I'm locked in the bedroom. Someone just broke the window. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. I sat on the bed, knife in hand, and listened. The pounding at the front door resumed, louder than before. The footsteps circled the apartment, slow and heavy. Then the phone went silent. The call disconnected. I tried to call back, but the line was dead. My heart dropped. The knocking stopped. I stayed in that room, silent, for what felt like hours, until the sun began to rise. Finally, I heard the faint sound of sirens outside. I opened the bedroom door carefully and found the front door ajar, scratches all over the frame. The window was shattered, glass on the floor, but the intruder was gone. The police arrived and took my statement. They searched the building and neighborhood, but found no sign of the person. Later, they told me they caught a man nearby matching my description, disoriented, covered in mud, muttering incoherently about being outside. That man never explained why he was there or what he wanted, but to this day, whenever I hear a knock at the door late at night, I don't answer. Story the end. The night started like any other. I was alone in my apartment, a modest second-floor unit in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. I had just finished a late shift at the hospital where I worked as a nurse. The exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and I was looking forward to finally getting some rest. It was around 2 a.m., and the rain was coming down steadily, pattering softly against the windows. The streets outside were deserted, the occasional flicker of a street lamp barely illuminating the wet pavement. I had locked all the doors and windows before I settled in, as usual, but the sense of unease had been creeping in all night. I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Yet, every so often I thought I heard something. An indistinct sound coming from outside that didn't quite fit the rhythm of the rain. Maybe a creak or a faint scraping, too soft to be sure. Around 2:30 a.m., I decided to make a cup of tea to calm my nerves and clear my mind before bed. The kitchen light was the only thing on in the apartment, casting long shadows on the walls. As I moved about, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel outside my front door. My heart froze. The steps were slow and deliberate, coming closer, then fading slightly, then coming closer again. I stood completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt suffocating. Then there was a soft tapping at the glass panel of my door. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to move. My body was frozen with fear, yet every instinct screamed at me to check. I slowly crept to the peephole, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Peering through, I saw nothing but the dark outline of a figure standing just beyond the porch light's weak glow. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. Whispering my address, I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay inside and keep the door locked. The figure remained motionless outside. I kept my eyes on the peephole as the minutes dragged on, feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the tapping turned into scratching. Sharp, frantic, and desperate sounds against the door and the side window. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard a voice, a low whisper, barely audible through the door. "Let me in." I froze, not responding, tears stinging my eyes. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. I was too terrified to move or speak. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint sound of police sirens in the distance. The figure outside finally moved away, disappearing into the dark, rainy night. The police arrived moments later and searched the area, but no one was found. They found scratch marks on the doorframe and muddy footprints circling the porch. I never found out who the person was or what they wanted. The incident left me shaken, and I moved away from that apartment within weeks. To this day, whenever it rains heavily at night, I'm reminded of those footsteps outside my door, the desperate tapping and the whispered plea that still haunts me. Story the end.